it's always risky to be an ally of the United States. Look at sort of their allies in Iraq. Where are they now? Look at Libya. They were allies with I don't know of whom, but now they are gone. Is it Syria? Yeah, they are around. They sometimes throw a little bomb, but there is no constructive result. Yeah, and it could be very much like that in the next couple of years in Ukraine.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. As the death toll climbs from Israel's horrific bombing campaign in Gaza and the U.S. threat for a broader regional war, all eyes are on the Middle East, making it easy to forget about Ukraine. But the war in Ukraine grinds on without pause, with lasting impacts on Europe and the Western-dominated order. So what's new with the war in Ukraine? Is anyone winning? How will it impact the future of Europe and NATO? What are the similarities to the war on Gaza? How will escalation in the Middle East impact Ukraine? And how is the war on Gaza exposing all of the hypocrisy of the EU in particular? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by prolific writer and author Wolfgang Streeck, Emeritus Director at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies. But before we jump into it, this is just the first half of this episode. The second half is available for Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Wolfgang, welcome back to the show.
I'm happy to be here.
So, when we initially scheduled this interview, it was, I think, about a month ago, and a lot has changed since then. Of course, I invited you on to talk about Ukraine, which is the issue that you write mostly about for New Left Review, and we're definitely going to get into the meat of Ukraine. And last time you were on the show, the war in Ukraine, I just want to note, was about, I think, 2 months. It had started 2 months prior. So now it's been about a 2.5-year long war. So there's no end in sight. So quite a bit has changed. But there is, of course, another war as we're speaking that's captivating the world's attention. And that, of course, is the war in Gaza. And I think there are some similar themes that apply with regard to the EU's posture, kind of following the US lead to actually prolong a war and avoid a ceasefire and cause this kind of potential regional escalation that would be quite catastrophic. And of course, I'm speaking to you from Lebanon, where, everyone is both devastated by the carnage they're seeing on their television screens, but also people are quite scared of what might happen here should another front open up between the Israelis and Hezbollah. So all that's to say, let's start a little bit with some tangentially related things with Gaza before we expand into just focusing on Ukraine. And one place I'd like to start, Wolfgang, is with EU Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen, who, as I'm sure you've seen, and you've written about, has been leading the kind of like Atlanticist cause in Europe, aligning 150% with the US on Ukraine, even as it harms Europe. And I see something very similar happening with her role during Israel's war on Gaza. She reminds us like every hour on her Twitter feed that she stands with Israel in its like civilizing quest to, against the forces of Arab darkness. She doesn't quite put it that way, but that's kind of what she seems to mean. But she's in lockstep with the US and unconditionally supporting the Israelis, no matter how many children are being bombed in Gaza. She has had no problem with the Israelis cutting off water and electricity and fuel to Gaza, despite, of course, complaining about Russia doing some of those same things in Ukraine. All that's to say, you have written about this woman. You've called her, the former defense minister in Germany who was incompetent at the time. I'm curious, can you tell our audience, who is Ursula von der Leyen and why is she like this?
Yeah, I'm not a psychologist, and nor am I a contemporary historian. I like to interpret what people are doing as a result of the structure in which they operate and the institutional incentives that they face. Now, the European Union is a very shaky construct. It includes, in this particular case, both Germany and France, which have very different views on what is to be done. Although the French are always sort of so Frenchly diplomatic that it's very hard to understand what they are saying. But for Frau von der Leyen, it has this sort of difficult job, her present job, to govern a European Union that is internally heavily divided. So how do you do this? You do this by bringing in power resources from the outside in order to force things together. And the only power resource that she can bring in is the United States and NATO. So by leaning heavily on the United States for political you can say capacity, she tries to survive this split between different European countries with respect to what is happening in the Middle East. Now, Germany is a sort of natural-born ally in this, because Germany is very heavily dependent for its national security on the United States. The US have about 30,000 troops in Germany stationed, almost as many as in Okinawa. Interestingly, these are the two largest American bases in Japan and in Germany. And Germany has no nuclear arms. It is sometimes said that they have delivered certain pieces that you need for nuclear arms to Israel, of all places. Certainly the Israeli submarines, nobody knows what they can carry, but you can think about it. So the French have their own nuclear arms, and that is why they are very much concerned about this sort of thing, and they do not depend so much on the United States as Germany does.
Interesting.
There's many other explanations, but this also sort of personal explanation. Let me say one thing in order to understand the sort of the psychology of the German public in this event. Now aerial bombardments, right, are something that Germany knows a lot about, because during the at the end of the Second World War, a city like Cologne, where I live now, looked exactly like the city of Gaza does today. And in the sort of post-war years, the question whether this kind of destructive all-over bombardment, whether this is compatible with international law or not, was sort of suppressed as a question in the acceptance of the defeat, as well as the idea that the defeat was hopefully was one, because otherwise we would have lived under the Führer, and so there is this sort of very strange willingness to accept this kind of thing if it is done for the right purpose. And while the Israeli purpose in Gaza is a just one, the Russian purpose in Ukraine is an unjust one in the view of our politics. It's a long speech, but that's probably sketches out what we're talking about.
Yeah, I guess that would seem to be how the German leadership at least views it. And, I wanted to ask your thoughts on what looks like an increasingly anti-democratic string of measures across EU countries, such as Germany, in response to protests. I mean, this essentially just suppressing protests, banning them altogether, pro-Palestine protests that are against Israel's behavior in Gaza, which I think, in some ways does build on the kind of censorial measures taken against those who perhaps were either challenging the escalation against Russia and Ukraine, or even, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it did seem as though Germany was outlawing any symbols of actual support for Russia's war in Ukraine. I mean, we don't have to agree with
Yeah,
whether it's okay to support Russia's invasion of
yeah, yeah,
Ukraine, but of course, like the whole idea of the West is that you have the freedom of speech and all these kinds of things. And I know that matters more in the US than in Europe. But then to see actual protest against German policy be
yeah.
outlawed in general, I mean, can we really call these countries democracies if they're outlawing protests? And I have seen videos out of Germany of like actually police beating protesters over this.
Yeah, police are always beating protesters. They do so in the United Kingdom and in France as well. Yeah, it's very disturbing. I can say it's very disturbing. And it began with the Ukraine war, when any form of dissent, with let me put it precisely, with the sort of very far-fetched war goals and aims of the Ukrainian government. Any expression of any sort of dissent on their insistence that there can be negotiations only after the Russians have withdrawn their military from Ukraine. In other words, have admitted defeat. After defeat, you can negotiate, not before that, and including the Crimean Peninsula. Yeah, and if you were of the view that this is not the right kind of diplomacy that you might want to employ in order to avoid a mass killing on both sides, you were close to being a traitor. Not just in the mainstream press, but also in political parties, in the trade unions, some of them, and yeah, that and now you see it's getting even more. And I mean, our foreign minister, this fabulous Miss Baerbock, actually, up to 2 days ago, publicly insisted that there be no humanitarian aid being sent to Gaza, until she was a day later told by the American foreign minister that this was not policy, and policy was to bring in, let's say, 10 trucks a day, just as a symbolic as a symbolic means of appeasing public opinion. Then she suddenly was for a humanitarian break. This is such it is, and it leaves you speechless.
It really does. It just seems so monstrous, especially when you see all the images coming out and you see actual videos coming out of people quite desperate for basic things like water.
Yeah,
And we're hearing this, of course, from the people who claim to be leading the civilized world.
yeah.
I want.
Then let me say that yesterday, the General Secretary of the United Nations, who is usually not an anti-American, to put it very mildly, yeah, publicly in the Security Council stated that this kind of policy is against international law and against humanitarian law, and that there had to be much longer breaks to the bombing, much more aid being shipped to these poor people in southern Gaza. And the German press reports this just sort of on page 3 at the bottom. Yeah, if the General Secretary of the United Nations says this in the meeting of the Security Council, it leaves you speechless.
Wow. The other thing that you kind of already touched on, but I'm curious your thoughts a bit more on is, given like I think that one thing that's quite scary, of course, what's happening in Gaza is horrible, but you have this kind of like potential escalation in the Middle East that
Yeah.
could take place. And, it's just so to see the Europeans and Americans just so thoroughly and unconditionally support shocking aggression that goes against all these international humanitarian norms that they claim to support and complain about in Ukraine is one thing, right? It's like one horrific part of this, but then another horrific part of it is something you were touching on, which is not only supporting cutting off electricity and water and food to this place, but also opposing a ceasefire, not just opposing, preventing a ceasefire. And one thing that the head of the UN did call for yesterday for the first time was a ceasefire. And, we've seen this happen both in Ukraine, and you mentioned that, and in Gaza now. Once again, we see the US playing this active role in preventing diplomacy, preventing a ceasefire, just like we saw in Ukraine. Whereas in both of these cases as well, you see China on the other side, a little too quietly, I would say, but they are calling for negotiations and for ceasefires. And I'm just curious, what does this say now that we've got these two big, awful, violent wars, where this kind of like China calling for ceasefire, US opposing? What does that say about the role of the US in the world versus China at this point?
I would say that in the Middle East, as far as I can see, the position of the United States is more reasonable than the position of Germany, and that has something to do with the fact that they know that if this spreads to the Middle East as a whole, then they will be in an utmost problem. Although, of course, with the United States, you always have this problem of opportunism, which has to do with the fact that nobody can really get to them. They live on a continent, a country the size of a continent, surrounded by two oceans, with two coasts, and then only two neighbors, or one and a half neighbors, because Canada is half a state of the United States, and Mexico is almost invaded by the American army in the so-called war on drugs. Then and if they go elsewhere and they lose a war, like in Iraq, it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine the Iraqi army marching into Washington D.C. and asking that George W. Bush will be turned over to the International Criminal Court in Den Haag? That is totally inconceivable. Yeah. So the price they pay for foreign policy blunders is very, very low compared to the price any other country would pay, except in the Middle East, where they know that Israel has nuclear arms, and that in the Israeli military doctrine, these are envisaged to be used the moment that the existence of Israel is at stake. In other words, you don't have to bomb them first with nuclear arms and then they hit back. It is part of the doctrine that it is part of their struggle for existence in the Middle East. And that makes the Americans extremely nervous at this point. Not so our German ministers, they don't care. I think because they have long forgotten to think about the strategic realities of this world. They are on the right side, and they are fighting for justice, and cost it what it may, and whatever justice is in their view.
Yeah, it also does seem as though, and this is again this is me just trying to psychoanalyze probably a little too much, but I have heard the argument made, and it does sound pretty fair or reasonable, that Germany's way of dealing with its guilt for the Holocaust is just unconditional support for the most aggressive Israeli maneuvers imaginable.
Yeah, that's what they say. It is the formula in Germany is the right of Israel. We stand for the right of Israel to exist. How that right is being exercised, and what exactly it implies. Does it imply occupation of the West Bank? Does it imply driving out the people on the West Bank and taking their land away to build settlements? Is that the right to exist? Or the right to exist within a two-state solution. Nobody in this country discusses this.
Wow.
What the right to exist is entirely left to the Israeli government, although that government has, since the Oslo Agreement, sort of become ever more radical in its claims for land and supremacy in the area where they live. Let me say that, I mean, watching the German and European scene, for 16 years ago, the Israelis locked up Gaza. Yeah. Now our foreign ministers, defense ministers, everybody else sort of traveled to Israel, and over these 16 years, at least once a year, what was in their briefing papers from their. It is inconceivable that the Foreign Office would not have told them, stay away from the wall around Gaza, because that thing should not be touched. It is absolutely abominable, and it will sort of blow up at some point, and don't get involved. And apparently they knew, having sort of being some sort of common sense, that this could not continue forever.
Mm-hmm.
But they never opened their mouth to say that. Yeah. The same thing with the Americans and the settlements. Everybody knows that if you build one settlement after the other, and Netanyahu tells you the last settlements, and then next year we'll see. If you continue this forever, there will become a moment when people get so desperate that they take to the absolutely most abominable means to make sure that they are seen as people who have a complaint. Yesterday, the General Secretary of the United Nations, in his speech, said that the events of 7th October have a prehistory, and they must be seen in the context of that prehistory. And did you see how the Israeli ambassador sort of exploded at the idea that there was a prehistory to this?
He called for the guy to resign. He called for the head of the UN to resign.
Because he simply said, what applies for everything in the world, it has a prehistory. Nothing falls from the sky. Yeah.
It really is incredible. And, I guess that you've basically explained why Europe is just like going full head, even more extreme than the US in this case on this issue, even though, it's like, I can't understand. Don't you understand that this could escalate into a regional war? We've seen that every war in the Middle East ricochets onto Europe in a pretty awful way. I mean, obviously, the people of the Middle East are the first and foremost to be the victims of any violence that happens here. But then, Europe is not far away. The refugee issue that took place following Syria, Libya, Iraq, and then, of course, like whatever spilled over into Western Sahara, it literally changed the politics of Europe and caused all kinds of problems, especially like with the rise of ISIS, and you had attacks across Europe. And it would seem to me that European intelligence agencies would understand the risk of further conflict in this region. But, something I wanted to ask you about that I think is an interesting dynamic to analyze here is, for the last few years, we've seen a massive shift away from the so-called war on terror toward one of this great power competition with the US and the West versus China and Russia, which, you've written quite extensively about. And, every Pentagon white paper says as much. And as a result, NATO has been given, a new life force. But it seems almost overnight following the Hamas operation on October 7th, we've returned to that war on terror rhetoric and all this sort of military equipment being moved back to the Middle East. Isn't the West going against its own Cold War interests by reinserting itself into an escalating conflict in the Middle East? Like, doesn't that take away or distract from the bigger war, the apparently supposedly bigger war that's supposed to be dominating versus Russia and China?
You should talk to Mr. Biden about this and Mr. Blinken. And I would think actually that these people are not up to the problem. The way they are used to making policy is from now to tomorrow, and responding to emotions of the day, thinking about it in longer terms. For the Americans, as I said at the beginning, it is not really necessary in the sense that they really are the last to be affected, because of their glorious retreat to their wonderful continent. Yeah. But, and then the Europeans, with a slight exception of the French, have learned in the post-war years that when it comes to the hardware of national security, then the leader is the United States, and you better follow what they are doing. And indeed, what they are doing now is they are watching very carefully what the United States say, because I don't believe that they speak openly to their allies. Yeah.
Yeah.
They, they sometimes it would be against their interests. Now, with this, the possibility that Trump returns to power in the next election, I think they are extremely concerned about the domestic support, and how they sort of weasel through these tensions between the Republicans who want to focus on China, and a significant section of the Democrats who are sort of attached to, yeah, uh, to what, to fighting authoritarianism in the world wherever it exists, and identifying the role of the United States in the world as bringing democracy to even the tiniest places. Yeah.
Oh, we've seen so much democracy be brought to the Middle East, haven't we?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I want
Yeah.
to I want to shift a bit more to Ukraine. Last time I had you on, like I mentioned, the war was just 2 months old. Today it is 2.5 years old. After all the tens of billions of dollars and weapons and aid from the West, Wolfgang, is Ukraine losing this war? Is it winning this war? What's happening here?
That depends. Then, before the war started, the Ukrainian policy in relation to Russia was not much different in effect from what is now the fact in Ukraine. That is, uh, postponement of the Crimean issue to some distant year, like in 10 years we will have a vote.
Mhm.
Then some sort of strong federalism or autonomy of the eastern sections of Ukraine, which would uh, also come with language rights, and like in South Tyrol's, or what the Italians call Alto Adige, where you have a German population which has sort of special autonomy rights, and it's all wonderful there. Yeah. So this was the platform on which Zelensky was elected with about 75% of the vote. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then in subsequent years, the goals, the war goals of the Ukrainian government shifted in a very radical direction, with the help, one can say, of Western allies who sort of contributed to shifting this power balance of power in the Ukrainian nationalist movement from a negotiated peace outside of NATO to entering NATO as Ukraine, including Crimea, and the Russians back in Russia, so to speak. Yeah, and this has had a lot to do with the impact of the United States and the United Kingdom. Now it is quite clear that, for example, still after the war had been, I think, 1 month old, there were negotiations going on in Istanbul, chaired by a former Israeli prime minister, who afterwards, or a few months ago, said that he had both parties sort of very close to each other to signing an agreement approximately along the lines of what now the situation is. And then, according to this man who was chairing the negotiation, then Boris Johnson showed up and told the Ukrainians that it would be stupid to sign, because they would get all the weaponry they would need for their sort of very much more ambitious nationalist goals. Plus, the American sanctions imposed on Russia would, within a matter of 2 or 3 months, sort of be so painful that Russia would no longer have the economic capacity to conduct that war.
Mm-hmm.
That was also what we heard at the time. What as a European public we continued hearing, and then suddenly it turned out that the sanctions hit us rather than the rather than Russia, and Russia has a sort of moderate economic growth of between 2 and 3%, whereas Germany has economic negative growth, and you see, so if you ask why this identification with then these goals have to be seen as a variable, not as a constant, and the West contributed to making them more ambitious than they actually were at the beginning. In my view, what was essentially at stake was the question whether a sovereign Ukraine would be a member of NATO or not. And for the Russians, it was clear it could not be a member of NATO, and they were willing to go to war to prevent this. They also miscalculated because I think there was in Germany, of course, we had a Soviet dependence in East Germany, and they had an army, elite. How do you say, college, where their commanders were trained, and there was one of them who was still alive, who up to the day of the Russian attack publicly let everybody know that they would never attack, because under their military doctrine, which he had learned at military college, they would have had to have 3 or 4 more troops amassed before they would attack, from which you would conclude that they made an awful mistake, thinking they could just grab Kiev and then impose a solution. So it's messy, completely messy. Yeah, but the European political elite, the West European political elites, a total failure in this context. Absolutely, they never had a voice of their own.
Yeah, to say the least. I mean, one thing that you wrote, you have this piece in New Left Review called "Bipolar Order," and one of the points you make is that the EU has been turned into this auxiliary of NATO. That's basically in charge of economic warfare. I'm just quoting you. While NATO became more than ever an instrument of American policy flagged as Western. Can you explain how this completes the kind of EU subordination to NATO that the US seems to have wanted to happen?
Well, you'll see it in the fall, when there will be a successor to the now General Secretary of NATO, and it is very likely that it will be Frau von der Leyen.
This woman.
Yeah, and that is a very good move from the perspective of turning the European Union into an instrument of NATO strategy.